How do you write a biography of a fictional character? Joseph Crespino will be here to talk about his new book, Atticus Finch, The Biography, Harper Lee, Her Father, and the Making of an American Icon. What role does hunting play in American culture? Philip Dray will join us to talk about his book, Fair Chase, the epic story of hunting in America. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Joining us now is Joseph Crespino. He is the author of a new book called Atticus Finch, The Biography, Harper Lee, Her Father, and the Making of an American Icon. He is a professor of history at Emory University, but he joins us right now from Houston. Joe, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So your day job, as it were, as a professor of history at Emory University, you've written a number of previous books, including Strom Thurmond's America and In Search of Another Country, Mississippi and the Conservative Counter-Revolution. Why a book about Atticus Finch, a book about literature?
That's right. I'm a political historian by training, and most of my work has been about the history of the South and national politics in the 20th century as the South is transitioning from a Jim Crow society to the modern South, so roughly from the 1930s through the turn of the 21st century. But when you think about that history, there is one kind of cultural production that looms so large that continues to be taught and read and to influence our understanding about the history of the Jim Crow South and about the history of American politics in the 20th century, and that's To Kill a Mockingbird. So I've been interested in the figure of Atticus Finch and that novel for a long time, but it's been very hard to kind of find a way in. We had for so many years just the novel itself. It was published in 1960, the movie in 1962. But what that changed in the summer of 2015 with the publication of Ghost at a Watchman, and that's what kind of gave me the impetus to write this book.
All right, let's talk about To Kill a Mockingbird. Why is it so beloved? I mean, why is it a staple of schools? What is it that we think it means? What place does it have?
Well, I mean, for one thing, it's just a great novel. It's a great story. It's a story wonderfully told, beautifully told. But it's also the character of Atticus and his relationship to his children. It's a novel that we assign year after year because it's a novel that kind of hits on the important themes of empathy and understanding, and we teach that in our multiracial democracy because we want students to understand that and to think about those things. But it's also a book assigned typically in 8th grade or 9th grade, and it's usually one of the first times that they're kind of dealing substantively with the history of racial injustice in the United States in a really meaningful way. And so it plays a really unique role, I think, in our broader political culture.
And is it also embraced universally or generally in the South and in terms of what it says about sort of the good Southerner?
It's not embraced universally. In fact, it's ever since it's been taught, there have been people who didn't want it to be taught for various reasons. One of the things that's important, I think, is that it's not just a book about the good white Southerner, or at least what we know now is that Harper Lee was not simply trying to write a book about the good white Southerner. Mm-hmm. She was actually very conflicted herself about how she wanted to portray Atticus. We know that because of the publication of Ghost at a Watchman. And so that's the part of the story that my book tells, I think, is very important.
How did you approach this subject as a historian?
One of the things I wanted to do as a historian is to find new sources. That's what we do as historians. And so the first thing I wanted to do is find out more about Harper Lee's father. She always talked about, very openly, about how her father wasn't exactly Atticus Finch, but that he provided the inspiration for Atticus Finch. He shared the kind of disposition of Atticus Finch. So I wanted to go and learn more about her father. It wasn't an obvious way in, but one of the things that was true about Harper Lee's father, Amasa Coleman Lee, or A.C. Lee as he was called, is that like Atticus, he was a small-town lawyer and state legislator. But unlike Atticus, he was also the owner and editor for 18 years of the local newspaper. So I went back to those newspapers, the Monroe Journal that he edited from 1929 to 1947. And there's no guarantee that, newspapers from that era in a small town in the South would have necessarily an editorial page or anything like that. So I just dropped in to see what I could find, and I found a gold mine. It was just an amazing kind of a discovery, because not only did A.C. Lee have an editorial page, but he had an active and an ambitious editorial page. He was writing 2, 3, 4 editorials every week, and about not just local politics or local matters, but state politics, national politics, the evolution of the New Deal, the rise of fascism in Europe. I mean, it's remarkable to see that when you consider that this is a man whose highest grade of education was 8th grade. That's another thing I discovered in my research. So it was just, it helps us, I think, that that's part of the first part of, one of the first third of the book is about the origins of Atticus. And it deals closely with trying to recreate A.C. Lee's political worldview through those editorials and through other research I've done.
Before we get into Atticus himself, I want to step back for a moment because though, as you say, To Kill a Mockingbird is pretty universally read in America, signed in junior high school or middle school, not everyone who listens to this podcast is familiar with the book. So in broad outline, what's the story of To Kill a Mockingbird, and how central is Atticus Finch, and who is his character, and how central is he to that story?
Well, what's interesting is that Atticus is not really central to the story of To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird is the story of really about the moral awakening of these young children. It's Scout Finch and her brother Jim and their best friend Dill, who lives across the street, and it's about their kind of escapades in this small town in Depression-era Alabama. And they are confronted over the course of the novel with the fact that their beloved father, Atticus Finch, has agreed to represent Tom Robinson, a black man who's been wrongly accused of raping a white woman. And the moral of the story is their kind of moral awakening over the course, or really kind of their kind of coming of age over the course of that novel, as they realize all these aspects about their beloved small town that they didn't realize.
And tell us about the character of Atticus Finch.
Atticus Finch is a noble, loving father. He is a crack lawyer. He is a man who defends Tom Robinson because he couldn't hold up his head around town. He couldn't look his children in the eye if he let this burden pass. He had to do it. That was his responsibility. He's the noble defender of the downtrodden.
So, I mean, he is pretty clearly a hero in this book and in the movie as portrayed by Gregory Peck.
Absolutely.
Is this a book that you grew up with?
I did, although it wasn't a book that I read as a kid and thought, oh, this changed my life or anything like that. I actually came back to it. My older brother, was a huge fan of it. He had lots of quirky interests, but when I was in graduate school, he said, you've got to come back and read that book. That's really an important book. And I did. And I got interested in it as a kind of cultural and literary phenomenon. But certainly the figure of Atticus Finch and this idea of the good white Southerner. I grew up in a small town in the Deep South, a town called Macon, Mississippi. It sounds a lot like the fictional Macomb, Alabama. And there definitely was a time, for a long period in my life where you kind of want to grow up and you want to be Atticus Finch. You want to be this, help this place you're from and do something good for it. And I think part of my kind of fascination with this book and its character is you kind of, most people realize that Atticus Finch is not a real person. And I just kind of got hung up on that fact and got hung up on trying to make sense of the mythology that surrounded this character that in this book that's so widely read.
So tell us about Go Set a Watchman, which, as you noted earlier, was published in 2015.
It's a bit confusing. Go Set a Watchman was actually written before To Kill a Mockingbird, but it was published 50 years later or so. It was published in the summer of 2015. It was discovered in a safety deposit box in Monroeville, Alabama, by Harper Lee's lawyer. And in that novel, Atticus Finch is an entirely different sort of character. He's exactly the kind of a figure you might imagine a 70-year-old arthritic white man in the Deep South would be in the mid-1950s. What happens in that novel is the adult scout, Jean Louise, comes back from New York, and the dramatic action of the novel is that she discovers that her beloved father, Atticus, a man who's noble and wise and wouldn't hurt a ground squirrel, has fallen in with the small-minded racist reactionaries of the white citizens' councils. And what happens over the course of the novel is that there are these series of kind of staged conversations that Jean Louise has with the men in her life, where they explain to her what's really happening in the South and how she doesn't understand because she's in New York, and she doesn't understand that they're actually respectable white conservatives in the South who will help lead the region through this tumultuous time.
So this book, Go Set a Watchman, was written before To Kill a Mockingbird and is sort of considered now, I think, to be an early rejected draft of that novel. Is that correct?
That's right. One of the things that I've discovered through the archives that were there at HarperCollins, Harper Lee's longtime publisher, is that this was a novel that was drafted. It was an independent novel. It was sent out by Harper Lee's agent, Maurice Crane. It was rejected by various houses. But while that novel was being circulated, she began writing this other novel that dealt with the childhood of the characters that she was writing about in her first novel. And that's the draft that was reworked over a number of years and eventually became To Kill a Mockingbird.
How did this book, Go Set a Watchman, this later published but earlier written book, sort of change your perception of Atticus Finch? I mean, who is the real Atticus Finch?
Well, when I read Go Set a Watchman, my reaction was, whatever you think about it as a novel, and there are plenty of people who don't think much of it as a novel. It's a first novel. It's difficult to write novels. She was working a lot of things out. But whatever you think about it as a piece of fiction, it is absolutely fascinating as a historical document that gives us insight into what Harper Lee was struggling with, what she was trying to get on the page there, and what was her first effort to try to write a sustained piece of fiction. And so it's absolutely critical in that respect, try to understand not who the real Atticus Finch is, because there isn't no real Atticus Finch. There's just a fictional character. But what we're able to see is the origins of Atticus out of her father's experience, and her struggling on the page to try to make sense of her father's kind of political heritage. And she's writing that book. She's writing both of these books in the late 1950s. And one of the things I try to do in this book is to contextualize what actually was going on in the South in the late 1950s. It's a period in which you have the rise of these right-wing, reactionary, militant segregationist movement, where Harper Lee is struggling to make sense of what she understands as her father's principled conservatism in the midst of this period of intense militant reaction. And that's what I think she's trying to do in these two novels, and trying to figure out what she thinks about her father.
In what ways did her own politics differ from those of her father, of A.C. Lee?
One of the things I've been able to do in this book is to find archival evidence of some of the disputes that they were having, father and daughter, in the late 1940s. One of the most important is in 1946. By that time, A.C. Lee is still editing his paper in Monroeville, but Nell Harper Lee, has gone to college in Tuscaloosa, and she's writing for the Humor magazine, and she's got a column in the student newspaper. And you can actually put the two father and daughter's writings alongside one another and kind of recreate the kinds of debates and arguments they might have been having around the dinner table in the late 1940s, which was a time of great transition in Southern society and politics.
Earlier you said, there is no real character, of course, of Atticus Finch, because he is a fictional character. And yet the subtitle of your book is Atticus Finch, the biography. How do you write a biography of a fictional character?
One of the things that this kind of cheeky title is drawing attention to is this bizarre way in which people tend to talk about Atticus Finch as a real person.
Mm-hmm.
This is how beloved he is people really think that he really existed, or people just, allied this distinction between fact and fiction. And, in terms of writing a biography of a fictional character, I didn't know of any kind of rule book on how to do that. And so the nice thing is, because there's no right way to do it, there's no wrong way to do it either. And so that's kind of the rule I followed in doing this project.
The character of Atticus Finch, as you pointed out earlier, sort of was an unambiguous hero, certainly as he was written in 1960. I'm curious if, from the perspective of 2018, if he sort of still stands up in that sense, or if current debate sort of sees him in perhaps more nuanced or negative way, even as he was written in that original novel, To Kill a Mockingbird.
I think that with the publication of Go Set a Watchman, in some ways the genie is out of the bottle. The idea of Atticus Finch as being simply this noble defender of the downtrodden, it's just not enough. We know too much now about what Harper Lee was trying to do in her fiction and what she was trying to get on the page. And in some ways, I think that makes Atticus Finch all the more interesting and relevant to our own day, because we can see how Harper Lee was writing in this period of militant segregationist politics in the late 1950s and trying to make sense of her father's heritage, her father's political conservatism at a time when the reactionaries had kind of were in the driver's seat in southern politics. And so I think to see what she's trying to do, what she's struggling to do, what she accomplishes and what she doesn't accomplish, has a lot of resonance for our own political moment when we think about the forces of conservatism and reaction that are alive in American politics today.
Do you think Go Set a Watchman compromised To Kill a Mockingbird in any way, or do you think it sort of still stands on its own and the characters still stand on its own?
To Kill a Mockingbird remains a beautiful novel about the coming of age of these vivid characters, and it remains a novel about empathy and tolerance and understanding in a time of social and political crisis. And I think the novel will continue to be taught and continue to be loved by thousands and thousands of people. But I do think that what Go Set a Watchman does with the publication of that novel is it just gives us a lot more context and for understanding what she was trying to do and the struggles that she had in shaping that novel.
You have a great epigraph to your book, which I'm going to read, and I want to hear the story behind why you chose that. It's George Eliot, and it comes from Middlemarch. Blameless people are always the most exasperating.
One reason I chose it is because Harper Lee and all of the Lee family were utter Anglophiles, and they knew all the intricacies of English history, and they read British novels constantly. And so you can imagine Harper Lee would have loved and drawn so much from George Eliot and Middlemarch. But I love that idea that blameless Atticus, he is exasperating. I think he's been exasperating for a lot of people. At the same time that there's so many people who adore Atticus, and they become lawyers because of Atticus, so they name their children after Atticus. There are also plenty of people who have read that book all the way along and thought, this guy's too good to be true. This guy's utterly exasperating, and it's exasperating that we have this model of political morality, of racial morality in the Jim Crow South. That is exasperating. And so I hope that my book can kind of pierce through some of the mythology surrounding the character and the novel so that we can understand it more on its own terms.
Is Atticus Finch too good to be true? I mean, knowing what you know about that period in American history and the segregationist South?
The Atticus Finch of To Kill a Mockingbird, yes, absolutely is too good to be true. Not to say that there weren't white lawyers defending wrongly accused African Americans. Absolutely, that happened. The historical record is clear on that. But the motivations, there's an anachronism to Atticus Finch. Why does he defend Tom Robinson? It's to give a moral witness to his children, right? He defends them so that he can look his children in the eye. That's a concern that comes very much out of kind of the 1950s and 60s. And one of the things I do in the book is tie that in to kind of the liberal ideas about race that were circulating in the 1950s. And it can be seen in classic documents from that era, such as the Brown versus Board of Education decision.
So have you gotten your tickets yet? I guess it's too early to get tickets to the upcoming Broadway production of To Kill a Mockingbird, which is opening, I think, later this year from Aaron Sorkin. But I assume you'll be coming up for that.
I would love to come up for that. If you know of any good way to get tickets, you let me know.
All right. Okay. Well, it's a story that clearly continues to resonate and provoke conversation. The book, again, is called Atticus Finch, the biography, Harper Lee, her father, and the making of an American icon by Joseph Crespino. Joe, thanks so much again for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Joining us now is Philip Dray here in the studio to talk about his new book, The Fair Chase, The Epic Story of Hunting in America. Philip, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So you wrote about a book about hunting in America, which we tend to think of as like a kind of bucolic out there in the middle of America subject, but you actually secretly live here in New York, in Brooklyn.
Exactly right. And it was very odd writing a book on hunting, being from Brooklyn, because if you mention it to people in Brooklyn, they're like, hunting? Why on earth?
Why on earth?
Well, then, of course, if you go out west to Montana, they're like, why are you even asking me about this? It's Tuesday.
Right.
We're going hunting. So, yeah, for me, it was I was interested as a historian in a subject that seemed to me to have a very long trajectory in American history, and yet is not really written about that much as part of our history. And also the fact that it's in the last half century or so, it's become a kind of red state, blue state issue. Whereas initially in the 19th century, it was much more of a sort of common, it was like a national pastime, basically.
Right. Yeah, I, as a journalist, had written a story about hunting around 10 or 15 years ago now that sort of asked that basic question, like who hunts, who fishes, what,
Right.
It was looking at it from a kind of cultural and demographic perspective. And it was interesting to learn that hunting is an aging sport. The population is aging, and it's a very white sport, which demographically speaking is not a good place to be in this country, given the shift in
Well, one
population.
concern in the hunting industry, so to speak, is that they say that if people aren't exposed to hunting before the age of 16, they will never pick it up as
Right.
an adult. And so there's a lot of emphasis on trying to interest young people in hunting today to sort of keep it.
Right. Well,
keep
and
it
it's
going.
an odd thing right now to try to urge children to pick up guns and, go out there.
Of course, exactly.
And also to try to get, people of color to pick up a gun and
Right.
hunt.
The two big trends in hunting now are women
Right.
taking up the sport, and also what they call DIY hunting, which is people who had never hunted before. I call it adult onset hunting. People who decide that if they're going to eat meat, they don't want to go through the industrial meat system, basically, and they want to find a way to do it themselves. And
I'm really interested in that part of it, because I remember too once being down in Texas and talking to an avid hunter, and he said, well, what we do here, what he did was to eat what he hunted, and that distinguished him, differentiated him from, sport hunters. And
Yeah.
that, and the way he talked, if he wasn't speaking about killing animals and hunting, he sounded like an avid environmentalist and sort of foodie.
Right. Well, it's interesting, of course, because the hunters really were the original conservationists. And so that's a very much a matter of pride to them. Hunting groups and hunters individually are very engaged with conservation issues. And really, that's where the conservation movement started in America, with people like Teddy Roosevelt, elite hunters of the late 19th century. Because obviously they were the ones who were out there. They
Right.
were the first ones to see the problem. And so, yes, that's a very strong bond that still exists.
All right. I want to get back to that, too, because there's a whole privatization of hunting grounds, which has kind of taken away from that conservation, or at least put it into a different context, right? Because you can't just kind of go out and hunt
Right.
on public land everywhere anymore.
That's one thing that's made hunting now less available to people, is that you can't just take granddad's shotgun and go up the hill behind your house like you might have 100 years ago. You have to drive hundreds of miles and go through all kinds of steps to do so. And
Right.
it's
And there are
expensive.
seasons and permits
Yes.
and the government, as it were,
Right. Right. Less habitat, I guess you might say. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So let's go back to the beginning, since you approach this as a history. What was hunting in America like before America was colonized? I mean, what was hunting like among the Native American population?
It's interesting. I mean, in terms of the colonial period, for me, where the story really begins, in a sense, is with the hunters who were, originally before the Revolutionary War, white hunters who went out into the woods were seen as kind of like antisocial characters. It was the farmer who was really like the model citizen of the colonial era. The Revolutionary War changed all that, because suddenly you had these backwoods hunters distinguishing themselves. And that's where you get the sort of myth of Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett, which persists into the present day even. America has always kind of prized the idea of the hunter as sort of the American hero. In every war, there's always this kind of reference to, we'll send in the American boys with their rifles, and of course you have like Sergeant York in the First World War and so on. So there was this kind of transition in terms of the way the hunters were perceived, and that kind of fed into the origins of hunting as a sport also in the early 19th century.
Well, so I'm curious what makes hunting in America different from, say, hunting in England, where it was an elite sport, right? It was something that the king would do. It's the sort of foxes and the aristocracy there. Did that come over to America, and then in what way did that intermingle, or did it not, with kind of Native American hunting practices?
Well, very much so. In fact, a lot of the impetus for hunting in America, sport hunting, came from British hunters who had come to the U.S. either to live or to just hunt. You have to remember that to them, America was this like a hunter's paradise. It was vast. There were animals here that they did not have: buffalo, cougar, what have you. It's kind of a funny thing that a lot of British gentlemen got off the boat in New York and said, okay, where are the buffalo? They thought they were in New Jersey or Westchester. Right. And then they were disappointed when told, well, you actually have to head out to Nebraska. But there was a great input. And one of the characters I describe in the book is a man named Henry William Herbert, who was a sort of part of an English aristocratic family, came to America and tried to write novels kind of in the spirit of Walter Scott. And a sporting newspaper said to him, well, you're a hunter. Why don't you write some sporting sketches? Well, he did, and he became really America's first feature sports writer. He changed his name to Frank Forrester, and he wrote these stories which kind of ennobled hunting in a way as a gentlemanly pursuit.
Was this in the first American sports periodical, which I love the name of this, American Turf Register and Sporting Magazine?
There were several. There was American Turf Register. Of course, turf was alluded to horse racing, which was another big sport at the time. But then there was one called The Spirit of the Times, which was a very popular sporting magazine. What's interesting is
what were the times? When did that magazine exist?
That was in the 1830s and 40s. And then ultimately, of course, it led to a magazine called Forest and Stream, which is still around as Field and Stream, which very much became the sort of gold standard of hunting. When did
it change from Forest and Stream to Field and Stream?
I believe like in the 1920s or 30s. But what's interesting is a lot of it was based right here in New York. There was Lower Broadway was where all these sports magazines were, as well as sporting goods stores like Abercrombie and Fitch, So it was very New York centered in a sense.
So that's what you tell to the Brooklyn people who ask, like, why are you writing a book about hunting?
Yeah.
So again, when hunting did come to this country, did it remain an aristocratic sport for a period, or how did it sort of become a popular pastime?
It did at first. It was very much ungentlemanly, and a lot of the sporting magazines featured articles by hunters, and of course, because these were gentlemen, they often would write under pseudonyms. They were lawyers and whatever. But eventually, especially after the Civil War, for instance, right here in New York, there was a man named William Adirondack Murray, who basically popularized the idea of hunting in the Adirondacks, which suddenly people looked around and realized that there's this beautiful area within a day's travel from Boston or New York, and hunting was offered as a kind of way in which you could. It was very much emphasis on sort of a manly undertaking as America became industrialized. Critics picked up on this idea that hunting was a way in which you could go out and re-engage with nature, not sit around and there was a lot of kind of very negative criticism of, don't be a namby-pamby, don't sit in your office, get out there. And so the Adirondacks became really kind of overrun, in a sense, by the end of the 19th century, to the complaint of many people who lived there, because suddenly tourists, hunters were flocking in, decimating the wildlife and so on.
So there's hunting as sport, and then there's obviously hunting was a big business. You had the furriers in the north and in Canada and then the food. So are you looking at this sort of in terms of primarily hunting as a sport, as a form of recreation? And if they were kind of two separate realms, who did what?
Most of my focus is on hunting as a sport, because that's how it really developed and became a commercial industry. But of course, the subsistence hunting is very important as well. It was very important really to the frontier, basically. The settlers, soldiers, the army did a lot. A lot of the soldiers who were stationed in the West, someone like General Custer, they were expert hunters because they sort of had to be, really.
Right, you had to hunt to eat.
You had to hunt to eat. Eventually, there was a kind of a clash, though, around the turn of the century, around 1900, between because the elite hunters, who tended to be conservation-minded, realized that the subsistence hunters did not care at all about how much game was killed and so on. And so you had these places like Yellowstone National Park. The U.S. Army had to be sent in there to basically police the poachers, as they called them, people who did not observe the rules of fair chase or whatever, and were just taking whatever game they could get their hands on. And so this was a battle that was fought both in the Adirondacks, out west, and it's sort of to the credit of the conservation movement and game management that they eventually won. In other words, the idea today that you can just go out willy-nilly and hunt as freely as you want is not tenable in any way.
So in the 19th century, how common was it to hunt for sport? I mean, was this something that 80% of Americans did, or 80% of Americans who lived outside of the cities did?
All I can say is it was a very popular, Teddy Roosevelt called it the national pastime.
Right.
Before baseball had that name. You have to remember that at that time when hunting was introduced, sport itself had a very bad name. It was considered sort of an underworld, ratting, cockfighting, a lot of it right here in New York, gambling.
Right.
And things that were not considered very, very admirable. So a sport like hunting was seen, again, this is sort of the British influence, was seen as a kind of noble pursuit. The gentleman, you got outfitted at Abercrombie & Fitch or wherever, you went out and you brought along your flask of bourbon or whatever it was, and it was a very kind of a genteel sport, if you can call hunting that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that was very much the emphasis, to sort of cultivate it as a sport. And as I mentioned in the book, women were also encouraged to come as well, because the promoters of the sport realized that their presence lent a sort of refinement to it.
So it goes from being an elite sport to being something that's promoted by Teddy Roosevelt, by the figures in the popularization of Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone, into something more democratic. And then at what point does it become something that is sort of clearly seen as not an upper class pursuit, to put it, except for, let's say, big game hunting, and elite safaris.
Right. That's a good point. Like today, the elite hunters, American hunters, are mostly, they go to Africa and pay $50,000 and more to hunt in these elite surroundings and go for big game. In America, probably in the early 20th century, I would say, you began to see it with the conservation movement itself, because many of the leading figures of the conservation movement, there are all these kind of testimonials of people saying, I'm putting my gun away because now I'm going to work for some of these same goals, my love of nature and the outdoors, but in a different way. I'm not going to hunt anymore. And so you did see a kind of attrition of people like Roosevelt and others, Madison Grant and other hunters, Aldo Leopold even. People began to sort of think of it as something that they would not pursue so avidly.
What is the hunting culture like, and who hunts today, if you had to kind of generalize about it? And when did it get that way?
I would say just, again, over the course of the 20th century, probably by the 50s and 60s, I think, is when you started to see a kind of a concentration more of hunting in small towns. As you mentioned, it's largely a white pursuit.
Right, passed father to son.
It's passed on in families. It should be said that those people who are into hunting tend to be very serious about it. And they, especially nowadays, just like everyone else, they're very technical. They take the technique and the science of it very seriously and spend a lot of money on it and so on. But still, it's largely become, it's not so much something that elites do anymore. As you know, there are all kinds of other options for recreation that people, between rock climbing or mountain biking or whatever.
Or Candy Crush or,
Yeah, there's all kinds of things, yeah.
Fortnite. It's interesting because I was talking to a novelist a few months ago who's based in Alaska, and she'd grown up in Alaska, and so did her husband, and she was an avid hunter, and they moved down to the States. And when I asked her, why did you move back to Alaska, she said one of the main reasons is that they hunt, but that they did not like the hunting culture in America and sort of the way that hunting was seen here, whereas in Alaska, I guess it's very much woven into the kind of Alaskan culture of eating what you kill and being very preservationist around it. And I don't know, to what extent that was her perception, or maybe it had to do more with the hunting in the precise place that she was in America. But is there, generally speaking, among hunters today, like to what extent are they doing it for sport? And to what extent is it really about eating what you kill and about, sort of population management of deer and bears and foxes and whatnot?
There's a lot of talk about that kind of thing, like habitat preservation and that sort of thing. I do think that many hunters primarily hunt for sport.
Mm-hmm.
One thing about, as you kind of allude to, hunters are very engaged with the idea that this is something that's a very important activity to them. They feel that it's historic, that human beings have always done it, and that for them it's a very important way to connect with nature. In other words, to be out in nature with a camera or driving a car through a national park just doesn't cut it. To be out as a hunter, that is to them a kind of more a true experience. And maybe that's kind of what the woman you mentioned was referring to. And it's very important to them. And it's something that non-hunters, I think, have a hard time perceiving or understanding in a sense. It's really, you sort of have to do it to know.
Right. Well, if there's an argument being made that it's about, keeping certain animal populations in check and making sure that there's a balance of nature. I mean, as you mentioned earlier, in a previous era in America, it led to the decimation of many animal populations. Right. How big an impact did hunting have on the ecology, especially animal ecology of the country?
Well, of course, it was huge in the late 19th century. And in a way, we've never gotten over that shock of what happened to the buffalo. Mm-hmm. And also, of course, I mentioned in the book something called the Plume Wars, which was where the Audubon Society started. Basically, all the water birds were being decimated because there was a huge industry in feathers and bird parts for women's hats.
Yeah.
And this took like an international effort. And here in America it was the first environmental sort of grassroots activism, I think, in America. And it was mostly women who were doing it.
When was this?
1890s. And they took it upon themselves. They were the people who formed a lot of the early Audubon chapters and said, we have to take charge of this because we're the ones who are being blamed for this fashion. Mm-hmm. These birds are being slaughtered. It was a very difficult thing because, of course, you had to then send Audubon agents into the Everglades and very remote places to basically do battle with local poachers who had been making their living for years from slaughtering egrets and flamingos and other birds. So those kind of things were very traumatic and, of course, inspired Roosevelt and others to take those first steps towards like making millions of acres, game preserves or national parks or whatever. In other words, that fed into that idea. And really hunting never was quite the same after that.
Do those preserves still exist, or are they no longer open to hunting to the extent that they were when they were first established?
Many of them do, although I think a lot of them now are not open to hunting anymore.
So other kinds of recreation.
Recreational areas, forest preserves, and so on. I mean, Roosevelt's an interesting character because he was a zealous hunter and was often in his lifetime criticized by people like Mark Twain and many other people for being like a sort of a man-child with a gun, basically. But on the other hand, of course, he was hugely responsible for a lot of conservation efforts, which he's rightly credited with. You
mentioned earlier that in addition to being an historian and to writing books such as this one, that you teach advocacy journalism at the New School here in New York. So if you had to write, after researching this book, an opinion piece about hunting, something maybe that you either believed going into it or something you came to believe in researching the book, what would you say? Like, what would that op-ed about hunting be that you would want to write right now?
That's a good question. One thing I came to believe in writing this book was I came to believe in something I call the spectrum of hypocrisy, basically, which is that human beings cannot help but affect, because we live in the Anthropocene era, we're going to affect wildlife in some way or another, even those of us who don't hunt. And so I was always conscious in writing the book about the spectrum of people who, between hunters and maybe non-hunters, but those who buy into the industrial meat system or wear leather goods. In other words, it's hard to, where does everybody fall? Really?
Right, we're all hunters in a sense.
Basically, we're all hunters in a sense, that's correct.
It's just some of us keep our hands clean.
Right. On the other hand, I also think, I came to believe that there's a progression of concern about animals from the mid-19th century on. It's interesting because it sort of coincided with hunting, the spreading of hunting. The idea that first, of course, animal protection organizations like the ASPCA, which started here in New York, on to the animal liberation movement, which kind of recognizes the right of an animal to its life, just like we have to ours. And now more recently, you hear people talking, as we hear, there have been a plethora of books about how smart animals are and how they communicate. As you know, the book list is filled with these, what fish know and so on. But there's new thinking there as well about sort of more like animal citizenship, basically. Like, will we ever reach a point where we're not participating in the kind of mass slaughter of animals that we would somehow move on, evolve to a different kind of relationship with them. Whether that will happen, exactly, I don't know. But in that context, I think sport hunting itself, killing animals for sport, is increasingly seen as unethical. And that's something that, again, that's partly, I think, is what is diminishing the interest in hunting. Just that sensibility is out there. And I think that also, I think, affects the reluctance of people to take up the sport nowadays.
Do you hunt?
I don't.
Have you ever?
I never have.
Not even for the research in this book?
I didn't. I'll tell you why. I didn't do it because I realized that hunting is the kind of thing you have to do as a regular thing. To go once, I thought, I'll just be like Woody Allen out there, like jumping at every.
So you didn't accompany any hunters sort of out there to kind
I certainly met a lot of hunters and spoke to them. The closest that I can claim is I grew up in Minnesota, where of course there are 10,000 lakes. I grew up fishing a lot, which is in a sense
aquatic hunting.
It's aquatic hunting, basically. And I one thing I remember from it, and this helped me understand the hunters a little bit, is I do remember that sense, that beautiful sense of connectedness you have, like being on a lake at twilight fishing and knowing that there are fish around and they're trying to outsmart you. And of course, they usually win.
Right.
And you're trying your best to capture them. And I remember it being a very intoxicating kind of feeling. Like even when it got dark, you wouldn't want to go in. You'd always be, and even if you didn't catch anything, of course, you could come home and say, well, that was still very enjoyable. And those are the kind of sentiments that hunters will often express.
And it's funny how palatable that is when people talk about fishing, to the idea of kind of going out and being very peaceful and at one with nature as you kill it off. And yet it sounds okay somehow when it's on a boat, but not in the field.
Well, it's probably because, of course, fish don't resemble us as closely as other, deer and other animals do. So I think that's part of it. It's easier to distance it.
Did you feel in writing the book that you came to understand those who do hunt for sport better?
I did, actually, yes. I was actually impressed with a lot of the hunters I met in that they, mostly with their seriousness, and also, as the title of my book implies, many of them adhere to what they call the fair chase ethos, which is something that originated in the 19th century. And basically it's that if you are going to hunt, you must do it in a way that is, at least to a certain extent, fair to you need to give the animals a chance to evade you. There are all kinds of regulations. And of course, the fair chase ethos changes over time as new technology comes around. Today, it might prohibit the use of drones, say, or something like that. In the 19th century, it had to do, like someone like Roosevelt campaigned against driving deer into water, which was a common way to hunt in those days, because in water, they become rather mostly immobilized, and they could easily be caught with a boat and clubbed basically to death. And it was considered a legitimate way to get your deer. But of course, nowadays, anyone who did that, it's long been outlawed. But those kind of things, the fair chase ethos, which came from kind of the British, the British really were the ones, they had something called true sportsmanship of, the sort of nobility of the sport. And those who sort of denigrated it were considered lesser hunters. So there is that idea, which I think is admirable. And also, again, the fact that hunters do put themselves into conservation, habitat saving efforts. I mean, I met hunters out west who they would spend a Saturday afternoon digging a tunnel under a road so that the deer could not have to cross the road, basically, which you might argue, well, they're doing that so they can save the deer for themselves. But still, the idea that I was impressed that people would basically give up their time. They're committed to the wildlife in this way.
Right. Although then again, all to I guess prolong the chase in its way.
One thing that's important in a way to hunters is that they see themselves in a sort of relationship with the prey, and they respect the prey very much. And that's hard, I think, for non-hunters to appreciate. They see it as a kind of, they'll spend days pursuing the same elk, calling to it across a river, hoping to lure it over. And when and if they accomplish their objective, to them, it's a very emotional. If you've ever seen pictures of jubilant hunters with their animals that they've killed, to them, it's the kind of conclusion of this incredible relationship they have with the very animal they've been hunting. I know, again, it's very hard for those of us who don't hunt to comprehend it fully. But that is, I believe, for them, they see it as the completion in a way of a kind of a beautiful link, really.
All right. Well, I guess that's The Fair Chase.
That is The Fair Chase. Yes.
Okay. Philip, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
The book again is called The Fair Chase, The Epic Story of Hunting in America by Philip Dray. Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, we've got Tina Jordan, John Williams, and Lauren Christensen. Hi, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
Hey.
All right, so we left Greg out because he's still stuck on Ulysses.
Oh, my God.
I know. Can you believe it? He still hasn't finished it.
Do you think he's going to finish at this
Let's all
point?
talk
Not
about
everybody
Greg.
reads as quickly as you, Tina.
Ulysses is a 3-day weekend read for Tina.
Oh,
Tops.
stop.
All
Labor
right,
Day.
what did
She'll
you
do
read,
Labor Day.
Tina? What are you reading?
Well, one of the things I recently picked up was Pale Horse, Pale Rider, which is a collection of 3 novellas from Catherine Ann Porter. And has anybody here ever read any Catherine Ann Porter?
Just a little bit,
Just
but
a
I've always
little,
wanted to
right?
read more. Yeah.
Because she's this Texas writer who's distinctly not a regional Texas writer. I mean, her stuff is set all over the world, and she's one of those short story writers who just agonized over every word. And so there's not an extra syllable in any of them, and I love them. And I might not have picked up Pale Horse, Pale Rider since college, and it's the story of a young woman, a journalist, during the 1918 pandemic when the flu was going on. And Catherine Ann Porter herself had the flu, and it had changed her life. I
love 1918 flu stories for some reason.
Well,
I'm like,
Catherine
drew
Ann
me
Porter,
in.
right? She almost died from it, and she was a beautiful young woman, and she woke up and her hair was gray. Like that's the story of what the flu did to her.
Wow.
But this young woman is living in a boarding house. She doesn't have a lot of money. She's delirious. Her soldier boyfriend is tending to her. She's fantasizing a lot about the farm on which she grew up. When she finally recovers and wakes up, she finds that her boyfriend has died. Like he's caught the flu from her and died. And I actually always knew that Pale Horse, Pale Rider comes from Revelation. So I went and looked it up before, getting over here today. And so the quote is, "The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are respectively the conqueror on a white horse, war on a red horse, famine on a black horse, death on a pale horse." And I don't know, the horse that she's fantasizing about, I mean, the flu, the war, it was like the death of a whole era. Like this, not just for this young woman, but for so many.
Is Catherine Ann Porter a writer that you just read growing up in Texas?
I did. I don't really know why. I suspect because of my grandfather, who was a college professor. He must have handed me a collection at some point. Most people know, if they know of her at all, they know of a novel she wrote called Ship of Fools. But it's actually the short story collections that won a Pulitzer and a National Book Award.
Which did you read, John?
I've also heard that, I think I've dipped into an essay collection that maybe the Library of America put out. Does that sound familiar? Essays and letters. I haven't really read her
Letters.
fiction. She wrote great letters, and I think I've read some of her nonfiction. But I need to delve further in. We should talk.
I've
You
got
should
all of it. So
direct me.
you can borrow anything.
Until then, what are you reading, John?
Until then, I am reading, you and I, Pamela, on the show many times over the years have talked about obit reads, which usually mean kind of obscure, like we learned about someone from an obituary and it sent us back to their work to find out who they were and what they were about. I'm doing something a little more high profile. I'm rereading Philip Roth's Zuckerman trilogy. And I actually reread The Ghostwriter, the first book, which I had read a few years ago. And then I read for the first time the next 2, Zuckerman Unbound. And now I'm about a third of the way through The Anatomy Lesson. And these were the first 3 novels that featured his alter ego, Nathan Zuckerman. And they're very different books, but they have a similar voice. And the character is obviously very consistent. In the first book, The Ghostwriter, he imagines that he may have met Anne Frank, who is alive and well in America. In the second book, he meets a very funny character, a guy who grumbles about being on a quiz show and being essentially scripted off of it because he was Jewish. And then it turns into also a book very much about the death of his father, which kind of previews his book Patrimony, which is a nonfiction book about the same subject. And then The Anatomy Lesson, which I've just started, is he's suffering some bad health. He has nerve pain in his shoulder and his back, and he's sort of laid up on the ground watching the Watergate hearings and having various women tend to him and keep house. I came to Roth really fairly late. I for some reason didn't think that I would be a fan, and so about 6 years ago, I went through my first kick and read several of his novels, and now I'm kind of doing it again. And I just think he's brilliant, like everyone else does.
Have you read American Pastoral?
I haven't. American Pastoral was actually one of the things that I'm not too proud to admit. I started a couple of times, maybe in my 20s, and didn't quite jive with it. And so, and I'm not sure why. So I'm curious, because I know that I'll like it now that I'm so deep into his work and I really admire him. So I'll be curious to see what the younger John was having a problem with when I go back to it.
So I have to say that these two, your reading and Tina's reading, are linked because one of my obits reads was based on the obituary of William Maxwell. And he wrote They Came Like Swallows about the 1918 flu and losing his mother. Lauren, how about you?
Well, I just picked up another high-profile book, but much more recent. I picked up The Girls by Emma Cline, which had just always been on my bookshelf since it came out and was so successful. But I actually similarly started it. I've started it a number of times, but for some reason, just didn't pick it up. Not for lack of interest. I just think things got in the way. And so I finally sat down and finished it. And, I was really taken with just the beauty of one-off sentences. That really kept me going. Every few pages there would just be something that really struck me, even if I have to admit I wasn't totally drawn into the actual plot of it. I don't know if it was just, for the hype or having heard so much about it before I read it, but the plot of it was a little bit frustrating. But what kept me reading was every once in a while I knew there was just going to be some sentence that just struck me. And they were always about young women and their relationships with not just men, but, other women and the world in general, and how difficult it is for a woman. So let me just backtrack to the plot. Evie is sort of narrating from later in life. She's middle-aged and sort of adrift. She's kind of lost herself, and she remembers the story of when she was a young teenager, very impressionable. Her mother has just divorced her father, and she's having a difficulty at home. She doesn't really have many friends. I think she has one best friend, but it's sort of a weird relationship. And she's notices these young women, young girls, and she's just obsessed with them. She becomes obsessed with this girl Suzanne, and they're these long-haired, beautiful, lanky, sort of free-spirited girls, and she is just entranced. And I think what's so interesting
sounds like a Sofia Coppola movie.
Well, I think I can see that. What I think is so interesting is that even though it is a book based on Charles Manson, the influence, the really sort of intoxicating power that comes over this young girl Evie is not really Russell, who's the Charles Manson character, but it's Suzanne. It's another one of the girls who Evie, begins her sexual life, and just in order to impress Suzanne, all she cares about is what Suzanne thinks of her and what Suzanne's doing. And that's just a really interesting look at sort of, what motivates young girls, what actually makes you grow up. Is the corrupting influence just men, or is it, women's responses to men too? And that's just such a complex subject matter that I think Emma Cline really minds well. The one thing I thought was frustrating, and I don't know if you guys have you read this?
I've read it.
One thing I found frustrating is that she's, the infamous murders.
Right.
And I don't think that's giving anything away.
Right.
She's left out of that scene, Evie, the main character.
Right.
And that's a really interesting decision for Cline to make. It was frustrating, but I felt, that was obviously deliberate. What did you think that was about?
I think it had to be that way for the whole plot to make sense in a way,
to
right?
To preserve her innocence?
Yeah. I don't know. I had a problem with the whole ending of the book. Like when you get to that climactic scene, and it's been a while, but doesn't Suzanne make her get out of the car?
Yes. She just says, get out abruptly.
Out of the car.
They're on the way, and they just abandon her in the middle of nowhere on the side of the road. And then she goes off to boarding school and lives this successful life.
Right.
Yeah.
What I loved about the book was getting the way it got inside teenage girls' heads.
Sure. Yeah.
But like you, I had issues with.
Well, that's interesting, because then it really is like a good counterpoint to Helter Skelter, because in Helter Skelter you really don't understand those girls at all.
Right.
You're just observing it, sort of, gaping at it from the outside of what on earth, why?
Yeah, there's no why.
Yeah.
Which just makes it even more terrifying.
You get it. You get it.
Well, it's a life that you can't relate to whatsoever, but the mentality, you're like, wow, I think those exact same thoughts sometimes.
Yeah. And you see actually how a young, impressionable, at loose ends kid could get in trouble like that.
Completely.
That's what you understand all of a
The
sudden.
personality.
Right.
Pamela, how about you?
Well, the book I'm actually reading, I feel like I'll be talking about for the next 17 podcasts. So I'm not going to talk about it now other than to say that it's big and it's long, and it's called The English and Their History by Robert Toombs. So you'll hear about that in future episodes. But what I read this past week was a YA novel by a writer named Ruta Sepetys called Salt of the Sea. And
Ruta Sepetys?
Ruta Sepetys, yeah. And this is her third novel for young adults. The first one, Between Shades of Grey, I first read when I was the children's books editor here. And it was the first YA novel, I think, that I came across as an editor, and the first one that I'd considered from that sort of vantage. And I was blown away by it. I don't know, Tina, did you read it at the time?
I did. I read it and loved it. And do you remember that it came out at the same time as 50 Shades of Grey?
Yes.
And it got a huge sales boost because people would go to Amazon or whatever and just be like, oh,
It's
you'd
the-
also
Yeah.
like?
Yeah, it's the reversal that's the problem.
They type in gray,
Right.
and
Or Shades of Grey.
Right.
But Ruta Sepetys, Between Shades of Grey, was a book that it was actually published in Europe for adults, but here it was published as YA, and I think it could go either way. Same thing with Salt of the Sea. She did another one in between, Out of the Easy, which is kind of an outlier between those two books because that one takes place in a New Orleans bordello, I think. And I haven't read that one. But Between Shades of Grey was really interesting. Sepetys is of Lithuanian heritage. And what she does in that book and in this book, Salt of the Sea, is kind of consider these populations that have just kind of been forgotten by history. And the first one, it was the case of Lithuanians who were sent basically to Stalinist camps in Siberia. And the protagonist is a 15-year-old girl, Lena, and what that was like. So it was kind of Solzhenitsyn meets, Anne Frank, really seeing, and frankly, just a population that I hadn't thought about. And Salt of the Sea takes that one step further in that it looks at four characters, and it's the narrative shifts between these four characters. One of them is a Polish girl, another is a East Prussian German young man, and then there is a young nurse who is Lithuanian and actually is the cousin of Lena in Between Shades of Grey, but the books are totally unrelated otherwise. And then the fourth is a young German Nazi, a man. And it's a historical fiction, but it looks at a true story of the Wilhelm Gustloff, which was a ship in the Baltic that was to save refugees or tried to save refugees fleeing Germany, and included some German officers and people who were certainly implicated in the Nazi regime, but also refugees from populations that were kind of stuck between Stalin and Hitler and were fleeing starvation and illness and poverty under terrible circumstances in this brutally cold landscape, only to get on this boat that was then torpedoed by a Stalinist submarine, and it sank. And it killed more people than the Titanic and the Lusitania combined. Wow. And I think is still one of the greatest in terms of loss of life, maritime disasters in history. And so, that's kind of hanging over this story. But it's just really well done. It's moving, and I think it won a huge number of awards when it came out in 2016. So
it does sound like these books are for very hardy young readers.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Yeah. I memean, my daughter read it before I did, and she was like really annoyed that it took me as long as it did to read it, which is not to say it reads slow. I'm just a slow reader. But I think it's one of a number of really well done historical novels for young readers that have come out in like the last decade, where for a long time you kind of had the Diary of Anne Frank and not that much more. And of course that wasn't fiction. So it for kids who like history and disaster, which kids like, and sad stories, this is one I would recommend. Next week and for the next 17 weeks, I'll go on to my next book. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.